Hello and welcome to the Science Fiction and Fantasy Factory. I'm your host, Mookie Spitz, and on the factory floor, I'm thrilled to have A.C. Wise, Miss Alison Campbell Wise. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I am delighted to be here.
And I'm delighted to have you. Matthew Kressel was on last week, and we talked about Rain Seekers. And you two share a writers group together in New York City, have known each other for quite some time. And he was the first on your list to corner and talk to. Thank you for making the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I definitely appreciate Matt recommending me. I'm actually in the outskirts of the Philadelphia area, but we know each other otherwise. I'm not in his sort of direct
Okay.
New York writers circle, but we've been friends for quite a few years now. I think, originally meeting through when he was editing Sybil's Garage many years back, and then met in person at a convention, and have just been kind of, hanging out sporadically ever since.
And you were his guest on his Nerd Count podcast fairly recently. You talked about meeting at Readers Con many years ago and how you guys have crossed over. And he also mentioned that you have a new book, The Ballad of Bone Road.
Yes, it came out on January 27th, so a week ago plus one day as of the recording of this podcast.
Terrific. And you are in a unique kind of focus. Your Venn diagrams come together, I think, in an interesting way. You're a prolific writer, primarily a short story focus from what I see from your oeuvre. You've written novels, novellas, and you're also an active reviewer, mostly of short fiction, Apex Magazine, Sci-Fi.
Yeah,
That's a neat kind of combination.
Yeah, I mean, I started out, I guess, with the fiction writing, short fiction. My first novel came out in 2021. I've got, 3 novels now, 3 collections, and 3 novellas, I think. So, nice, even or odd number of each, but 3, 3, and 3 is pretty good. And yeah, I've been reviewing short fiction for, I guess, maybe over 10 years. I've lost count of time, but quite a few years now. So I have a regular short fiction review column with Locus magazine and one with Apex magazine.
Terrific. Yeah, the short story as its own modality is a little bit marginalized. Everyone talks about books and big books when they're talking about books at all, as most people's attention spans are diminishing. They're on Netflix. When we're looking at science fiction, fantasy, and even horror as a genre, most of the eyeballs and asses, as I like to say, are in multimedia.
Yeah.
But it's good to keep the home fires burning for terrific science fiction. And as I understand your work, largely fantasy, you've shifted into horror. Your latest book is a nice genre mix of what seems like fantasy and horror. And you're in the sweet spot, at least according to how marketers view ideal targets. The biggest growth in indie authorship and publications in general, I believe, is this fantasy horror category. Ghosts are getting saucy, as they are in your book.
Yeah, well, one hopes it's a genre that's growing. I've always loved both fantasy and horror, and I can't seem to resist, mashing up genres a little bit when I write. Um, you know, Sticking to just one lane doesn't seem quite as interesting as hopping all over the place. So I don't know if that makes my work easier to market or harder, or hopefully that means there's a little bit of something for everyone in there.
I think that the readers are maturing, at least in the sense of catching up to sensibilities that are in these other modalities. People are getting a little bit bored with conventional storytelling. And just like in music, you have reggae, ska, punk. You have the new bands that are taking bits and pieces of styles and then calling it their own. Linkin Park, right? with a hip hop, rock, rap. And I'm sensing a similar trend in in publishing and writing. And I think you exemplify that in an interesting way.
I'd like to think so. Yeah. I mean, again, I like things that sort of, play in the spaces in between as a reader, as a viewer, as an appreciator of the genre. It's kind of interesting to see how people sort of remix them and take elements from each and bring them together. And even, with what you were saying with music, it's always interesting to see, somebody do a completely different, let's say like a folk cover of a hard rock song or vice versa, or, taking elements from each and just, playing in that space in a crossover way. It just makes it, a little more interesting and brings something fresh, whether it's, to something reading, whether it's music, whether it's art. It's just sort of fun to see those combinations.
And you do reviews, criticism, and your own creative writer. And I seem to think that this is almost two sides of the brain. There's different faculties that are operating, and some people can play rhythm and lead guitar and do both well. And I've read your reviews and some of your works, and I think you do a wonderful job just compartmentalizing, but at the same time integrating a very empathetic sensibility, a focus on accentuating the positive, and being very, very character and theme focused, which to me is very, very refreshing, especially for science fiction, especially in horror, where world building and problem solving and plot elements seem to override any real emotional connection to character, to circumstance, to apocryphal allegory and
Yeah.
lessons that we might learn.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm always really interested in is the way certain works talk to each other. So when I'm, reading an issue of something or, reading sort of multiple stories, I kind of like to look at not just the story itself, but sort of how it's in conversation with other elements in the genre. Specifically with the review column I do for Apex, where it's a little bit more of sort of like picking and choosing a couple stories to focus on across different publications. What I really do look for is those sort of resonant themes and the way that different authors may be approaching, a similar subject matter or a similar tone or, whatever it might be. Because I just sort of find that interesting to see, where there might be connections or where they might be looking at, different sides of a similar issue or just different facets or different ways of expressing something similar. And it's also kind of interesting to see that too. And the reviews I do for Locus tend to be a little bit more of a, full issue review. So I'll look at, the entire issue of Asimov's or the entire issue of Clark's World. And even then you kind of see certain themes sometimes resonating between the stories, whether that just happens to be, what the editor received that month, or whether, they sort of have stockpiled a certain number of works and are placing them together in the issue because they do explore certain themes. So again, it's always sort of interesting to see that because one assumes that, the authors probably came up with these things completely independently, but they just sort of happen to speak to each other in a way that's really interesting when you read an issue through from cover to cover.
Yeah, the lens of your criticism is relational in that sense, from what I can tell, but it's also intentional. So I was a theater critic in Chicago back in the 90s. And for about a year and change, I saw 2, 3 plays a week. It was Second City, Third City, on off Broadway. I saw
Mhm.
everything. And it usually fell into a bell curve of
Mhm.
terrible to terrific, with most in between. But the hat I wore as a critic was to focus on the intent of the playwright, the director, and the success or failure of execution. There were many plays that I saw that I hated. I personally hated it, but I gave it a 5-star review because I felt that it was true to the intent and execution of the creative people who passionately put their time and effort into this production. And I sense a similar sensibility with you because you review such a broad swath of stuff. And I don't get this bias that I get from a lot of critics that if it doesn't fit into my box of my personal preference, however subjective, then and if it fits my worldview of what constitutes awesome literature, then it gets a thumbs up. And I sense that objectivity with how you look at what you're reviewing, which is very refreshing.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the approach I try to take of, meeting the story where it is, or trying to gauge, what the author or the creator's intent is for a work, and try to, evaluate it on that basis versus kind of going and deciding, well, I'm in the mood for banana bread and I'm really mad that I got a cookie instead.
Yeah, I don't think
Um,
that's fair. And
Judge it as a banana bread.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that helps you. And this is the crossover from reviewer and critic to creative writer. There's a broad swath of styles that you indulge in. You tend to be, again, this is just me, my bald head looking at your good stuff. You tend to be basic. There's no extra fluff in your writing. You're hard hitting, again, very character focused, very, very theme rich. And there's a sense of implicit storytelling in how you do what you do. You don't hit people between the eyes with lavish descriptions, and you don't get into too much psychological detail, just enough to entice and poke and build up tension in a way that I think is very mature and very fun to read, because you're asking me as a reader to become immersed and to pay attention. And the trade-off is rewarding in that I'm with you in the storytelling. I don't feel like you're telling the story at me. I feel like it's a shared journey.
Yeah, well, that's very good to hear. I mean, it's always, a little bit of a challenge. I feel like sometimes to strike the balance of, giving enough so that the reader will follow you on the journey versus, not explaining enough so that they get lost, but not overloading them with anything. So I'm glad to hear that it seems to be effective, and, a good editor helps a lot. And, second set of eyes from, other writers that I swap work with is always helpful too, in finding that balance, because, sometimes as an author, you kind of know you're holding the whole story in your head and it makes perfect sense to you, and you're not seeing that that's not coming through on the page in the way that you intend it to.
Yeah, and for shorter works, you hit it and you hit it fast, right?
Mhm.
As Mamet used to say, get in late and get out early. And you do that very, very well. For longer work, it's a little bit more challenging because there's more dimensionality and inherent complexity. Tell us a little bit about Ballad of Bone Road, how that erupted in your creative zeitgeist, why you opted for longer form to tell that story, and then the blending of these genres. You've got a couple, they're staying at what looks like an alternate multiverse version of New York City. There's a haunting, there's a legacy, there are ghosts. So, without too many spoilers to get folks excited about your latest book, give us some teasers and give us the writer's vantage point of its creative germination and how you got to where it is.
Yeah, I mean, with some things, I don't know that it's a novel from the start. I feel like this one did feel like I knew it kind of wanted to be a novel. A lot of the way I write is sort of a process of discovery for myself. I'm not necessarily a meticulous planner and plotter. I really respect people who are, but that's, never really been the process that works for me. So I sort of had, little bits and pieces of ideas, this idea of, a setting that was kind of like New York, but not quite, much more sort of haunted and more fantastical, where the Fae had once been involved and are kind of, still within the margins of this world, but not an active presence. So within that setting, I also kind of had the idea of, two people going to a very storied hotel and accidentally getting caught up in one of the hauntings there, and then two investigators coming in to deal with what they think is going to be a relatively straightforward haunting, and then finding that things are sort of much more complex than they realized, and that there are sort of intersections with their own lives and their own backstories, and so things just kind of snowball from there. So yeah, I sort of started with some pieces and tried to figure out how they fit together. Was the basic process.
Yeah, the oxymoron of a straightforward haunting that
Right.
goes off the rails, I think, nails it. which is you've created a fantastical universe, and then within the parameters of the universe itself, you're upping the game. So the characters themselves, who are used to some amazing things, have to recalibrate.
Exactly. I mean, I sort of like the idea of a haunting that was, not exactly intentional, and, a haunting that was not necessarily threatening, because you get a sort of, I guess a traditional haunted house story might be the house or whatever is in it being antagonistic to the humans that are there. And I sort of wanted to take a slightly different approach where, the intent wasn't necessarily to scare or upset people. Um, but, bad things do kind of still happen the way they would with a haunting, but it's not necessarily because the haunting is malicious and, you know, angry at the humans, as it were.
Yeah, recurring themes that I sense are longing and guilt, regret. And it's not so much that we change too much with the lessons of life or the allegory of the story that you're telling, but we're almost reminded of ourselves as you get to the end, whether it's sudden or whether it's a little teaser. Is it the same kind of attitude that you applied to this bigger novel in terms of theme and kind of the overall mood of the thing?
I think so. I mean, I think, with a lot of my stories, they do tend to be, sort of melancholy hauntings, if they are hauntings, or, in whatever way I try to use genre kind of as a lens to explore, you know, the human condition, I guess, which is, the kind of thing I like to read as a reader. So the best, speculative fiction, I feel like, does sort of hold up a mirror to the real world, even if it's using a lens that's fantastic, where there are ghosts or monsters or dragons or whatever the case may be. It is kind of still talking about our lives and about the human condition. And I think, people are kind of starting to understand a little bit more that that's kind of what fantasy and science fiction and horror can do. Whereas I feel like there used to be the perception that, oh, those are, genres that aren't serious. They don't say anything important. It's just, lasers and dragons, and it's all sort of about the window dressing and the setting. It doesn't deal in characters. It doesn't deal in important themes. And I think, you know, maybe part of it is even sort of media, visual media, where fantasy and science fiction is getting more popular. Things like Game of Thrones on TV, or all the Marvel movies, where it's become much more mainstream. And also, people are realizing that genre elements can be used to tell, deeper stories or more interesting stories, which is really nice to see as both a writer and a reader, that, the genre that's my favorite is getting a little bit more respect.
Yeah, it seems to be plagued by Sturgeon's law, which is 95% of science fiction sucks. And the retort to that is usually 95% of everything sucks. And he
Yeah.
just happened to be a science fiction writer and critic. And to your point, I see cross currents though. On the one hand, science fiction is doing some heavier lifting, as is fantasy and horror, where it's becoming deeply psychological. And in ways, you're a trendsetter. You're focusing on character and mood more so than, let's say, overt plot elements and world building. And that's great to see. It's becoming literary. It's been literary the whole time, and now there's an embrace of that. And
Yeah.
on the other hand, because it's shifting into other modalities, which are exponentially more popular, way more people are watching science fiction movies than maybe spending time reading science fiction, arguably. And I think same rules apply to horror and fantasy. How do you reconcile that dichotomy over the last 20 years? Your bibliography is pretty extensive, over 100 short stories published over 20 years, and you've got novellas, you've had the columns where you're the critic and reviewer. You've been entrenched in these genres for quite some time, and you've seen it evolve. You've seen not only the genres evolve and change, but society around it and entertainment as a business around it. Where was it where are we now? And what up in this crazy world that I hate to even say it out loud, AI, but we're obviously at an inflection point. And I would love to hear from a great legacy author with this kind of experience, both on the critical side and the creative side. What is going on?
Well, I think, one thing that's been really nice to see, since I guess first started publishing and first started sort of reading short fiction is that it has, even if it doesn't have the same sort of level, I guess, of popularity or accessibility as it did in terms of, when there were dozens of glossy print magazines on newsstands and people read short fiction much more widely outside of the genre. I think within the genre it has become more broadly accessible by so many publications being online, and just the ease of authors from all over the world being able to submit work, whereas a lot of times you would only get work by authors within the same country as the publication was based. Seeing the rise of translated fiction has been really, really wonderful, and just sort of opening things up. So does feel a lot more global or globally accessible, I guess, than it did before, which has been really, really nice. And as we were saying before, sort of, a little bit of shift in the perception of the genre from outside the genre as being, a valid thing, kind of seeing, it does feel like, for a while within bookstores, the sort of fantasy, science fiction, and horror shelves, I mean, within physical bookstores, like chain bookstores, were sort of shrinking and condensed. And now it seems like they're expanding a little bit again, which is nice. And there's been, I feel like, a resurgence too in independent bookstores and even genre specific independent bookstores, which is really, really nice. There's the Twisted Spine in Brooklyn, which is a horror focused one. There's Thrillerdelphia in Philly, which unfortunately I haven't had a chance to go to yet, but just opened recently.
Both are great names.
Right?
I lived in Brooklyn in Park Slope for a while, so I'm probably not far from the specialty shop, right, that you mentioned. Yeah.
But it does seem like there's, more genre specific or specialty bookstores coming back, which is really, really nice, since for a while it did kind of feel like, the chains were driving out any independent bookstores, regardless of ones that were, super niche independent bookstores. So that's been really, really nice to see. And as for, sort of the rise of AI, it's discouraging, but it's also encouraging to kind of see so many creatives across various industries kind of standing up and trying to, speak for the value of human created art versus the desire to, cut artists out and maximize profit for whoever happens to own whatever it is that is trying to be sold. So it is kind of nice to see that pushback, and nice to see the commitment on behalf of a lot of authors to try to, push back against contracts with bad language, or push back against, for example, audiobook contracts that don't have a stipulation for a human narrator, or, book contracts that, for publishers that might use AI art on a cover. Trying to push back against that as much as possible and make sure that, creatives across mediums are getting paid and getting recognized for the work they do.
Yeah, as our content is being just chopped up, broken into tokens, and integrated into the LLMs without consent.
Yeah.
So your books, you've been a prolific writer for 20 years. Your stuff's been chopped up and devoured by OpenAI and Anthropic and Grok. They ate up ACYs, and now when you do a query, a little bit of your goodies are no doubt influencing the prompt responses, which is infuriating, but kind of the par these days.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like, if anybody who's published anything or released anything that is out there in the world is probably going to be grabbed up by, various AI, LLMs, whatever. And, there's very little, I guess, that people can do to protect themselves against that. So all we can kind of do is, fight back and push back, and, whatever various lawsuits are going on against these companies that are taking work unauthorized for their own profit. It's, kind of all you can do, unfortunately.
We're on Sarah Silverman's team.
Yeah.
So let's dive into your reviewing for just a second, because I do find it so fascinating. For Apex and Locus, there's so much content. This is the irony, and in a sense, a paradox of everything we've been talking about, which is interest is there, but it's jockeying against all these other modalities. And then, despite that, you have arguably more people publishing and creating content than ever before. The facility of content creation and distribution. You got indie authors. If you finish your manuscript, Hell's Bells, you upload the PDF into KDP, and you've got your ISBN numbered book on your desk in a few days. So,
Yeah.
booyah. So, who in the past we knew who the gatekeepers were, which is there were really only a handful of key publishers and reviewers such as yourself, and you prayed like I want to get in there, I want to get published. I go through the formal route of getting attention, getting validated, maybe getting edited, and then getting it in front of reviewers like you, getting Locus magazine to review you, kind of infiltrating the tribe of science fiction and fantasy. And now it just seems so fragmented. Everyone's doing everything. It's hard to tell which direction the genre and genres are going. And the tail is really long of both writers and readers and distribution platforms and the like.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I feel like a good problem to have that we're sort of spoiled for wonderful things to read that, even as some magazines sadly have to, fold or cease publication or go on hiatus, that there's always new ones rising up and, you know, bringing new voices to the field. And, I always try to read as much as I can. And I always feel like I'm, barely scratching the surface, which again, I feel like is a good problem to have. I mean, I know it's definitely from an author perspective challenging, like you say, you do the best you can, you get to the publication stage, and then you hope people find it, and then, hope somebody reviews it or, the people sharing the word about it. But there's just so much out there that it's, hard to grab attention. But at the same time, I'd rather have, be spoiled for choice as a reader, and even as a writer to have many other people putting their voices and words out there rather than just have sort of a much narrower or more limited selection. So
How would
you
you
know
appraise the quality of the work over the years? You've been reviewing for years. Do you see trends or patterns? And prior to the LLMs with just 100% human on keyboard, have you seen growth? In baseball, it's gone from the 85 mile per hour fastball to about 90, 95. It keeps getting better. It's kind of Moore's law everywhere. Has quality improved? And then since 2022, have you seen any kind of state change with what's being submitted and what you're looking at and reviewing?
I mean, I think that there is a certain subjective thing. There's like, I feel like fantastic work since I started reviewing up till now. I don't feel like I've necessarily seen a drop in quality or a rise in quality, but just the fact that there's more things appearing in more places is really, really wonderful. In terms of, the change or with the, the rise and proliferation around AI, I do feel like it has been challenging for a lot of editors, sort of adding to their workload in a way where they have to vet things in a different way, run them through, something that is hopefully going to catch whether it's AI created or not. And then, there's also the sort of whole debate around, how, like, what counts as AI assisted when it comes to writing. Like, is spell check going to cause something to ding, or is there going to, since AI is embedded in so many sort of writing tools, whether you want it or not, you have a simple word program and now AI is shoved into it. Like, is it picking up predictive text that you're not even, and is that going to ding as AI? So it's kind of an interesting and challenging time to be, I guess, a creative in any field. And you never know once it's out of your hands as a writer, sort of what's going to happen to it from there. I mean, hopefully one trusts most editors and publishers to be ethical as well, but there's always a chance of, somebody coming in and, slapping AI art on something, or, using things in a way that you didn't anticipate. But yeah, I mean, again, I feel like it's ultimately, not the AI part of it, but just the sheer proliferation of publications and new publications that are always rising up is always sort of a good problem to have. And that it, writing in general is more accessible to more people.
And as such, I think it's an interesting barometer of the society that engenders all of this creativity. So back in the late 60s, even before the moon landing, you had Gene Roddenberry boldly going. You had this vision of Starfleet. There was no meat eating. You'd create a meal in a transporter kind of beam. And, the mission of the Federation was always to do good, not intervene, explore. It was kind of an idealized construct of the 60s civil rights sensibility, actualized. And a lot of science fiction has been in that genre of being allegorical, being at least implicitly political. And obviously, everyone has their worldview that either consciously or unconsciously infiltrates what they're trying to do. And then you had, Herbert with the Dune series. You had the Ender's Game, which we could argue was on the opposite side of that political spectrum. And the pendulum has been swinging back and forth politically, radically in the United States, especially over the last decade. And science fiction has always been great, fantasy and horror too, of projecting that societal angst that in ways that pops up in both ways. It's a catharsis for those people who are like, hey, what the hell's going on? Let's keep on site for our ideals. And in the other sense, it's like, booyah, yeah, let's go get some. Are you seeing that too? How has the political polarization, the radicalization of American politics and culture influenced and infiltrated science fiction, fantasy, horror, for good or bad, from your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you were saying, I feel like genre has always been in a way, or maybe just, art and literature in general, not even just genre, but, sort of a reflection of current anxieties, or, things people are concerned about, or things they're even processing for themselves through fiction. It is interesting, actually, not necessarily politics specifically, but it does feel like I'm seeing in my reviewing a lot more stories that are confronting AI, whether it's, anxieties about AI, or whether it's, and here's potentially good applications for AI, or, I feel like there's also been a lot of stories that I've seen recently in my reviewing that are sort of reflecting anxieties around healthcare, or the way technology and healthcare intersect, or the way corporations and healthcare intersect, which does feel like it's kind of, a reflection very much of our moment in time, with, just how difficult the healthcare system is to navigate in the United States specifically, and how it does feel like, corporations come first, and, actual benefits to people come last. So I do feel like, you see that reflection in a lot of things, but it's also sort of interesting. I mean, short stories can be a little bit more immediate, but in terms of, novels, the cycle of publication is typically long enough where, it's not the exact moment in time that's being reflected, but you might a couple of years down the road see things that are reflecting elements of sort of what's happening in this exact moment in time. But yeah, I mean, I do very much think that literature and genre specifically, I guess, is sort of a good vehicle for, capturing a moment in time, whether it's addressed directly or indirectly. You kind of see, some of the things that are on people's minds, or the things they're worried about, or the things they're hopeful for, reflected in their work.
Yeah, and if you look at trends which are becoming acute, almost radioactive at the moment, you have the generation gap and kind of internecine quarrels between genders within generation. The Zoomer female is zooming, and the Gen Z male is tanking in a big way. And this is a huge conflict, and it's becoming endemic, reverberating through society. You have the transgender crisis, in my estimation, is horrific in terms of that being the new target for marginalization and abuse.
Mhm.
And we could go through the list of these societal crises. And I think as an author in 2025, 2026, these hot button topics give our writing a sense of urgency and an underpinning in terms of creating characters, situations that aren't just ad hoc stories, but are grounded in societal angst and pressure points that could add dimensionality, I think, to writing,
Mhm.
especially in these genres where you can extrapolate and just go wild in what if kind of scenarios. The counterfactual conditional lends itself really well to horror, to fantasy, to science fiction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the best literature, art of anything is sort of, a tool for building empathy, for seeing the world through somebody else's eyes, or, you know, getting to know a person, even if they're fictional, who might reflect, real people and real experiences. And it sort of opens up a world, that takes you beyond your own, perspective and personal experiences and things like that. So it is, in theory, a way to connect people and to build empathy. Unfortunately, not everybody reacts that way, but I do think, at least, within the genre community, I have definitely seen a lot of positive things in terms of, taking on social issues directly and indirectly, projects that actually raise funds to support, the Transgender Law Center, or, various other good causes, or, bookstores or publishers kind of stepping up and, making a portion of sales, go support a good cause. So it's not even just the fiction itself that's kind of trying to break down barriers and build empathy, but, the community itself kind of rallying to support and trying to help and, um, support good causes.
Here it gets a little iffy, right? You don't want to be preachy. You don't want to proselytize. You don't necessarily want to put up the soapbox and start rambling in your story. At the same time, you have to recognize your own worldview and a feeling of perhaps at least triggering dialogue and adding dimensionality to your storytelling, which might come across as provocative, yet at the same time, hopefully helpful to get readers thinking and look beyond their own sensibilities to the what if of a better society. That's been a hallmark of science fiction, I think, going all the way back. Heinlein, Asimov, Bradbury, the usual Ursula Le Guin. It's all been toward creating a better world and seeing what happens if we don't. You've done that, maybe not as overtly, but you've had marginal characters fighting injustice in their own subjective kind of way.
Yeah, I think, as you were saying before, speculative fiction in general has always been sort of an inherently political genre. And I mean, in general, I feel like there's no such thing as, something apolitical or something neutral. I mean, it's always across all spectrums of life. Either you're upholding a certain worldview, whether there's no such thing as sort of neutral, or, the idea of sort of keeping, politics out of sports, or whatever, the latest rallying cry might be. I mean, everything is political, and it's always been political. And, the people who kind of claim that that isn't the case, or, they don't want politics mixed with thing X or thing Y, are usually saying, please just reflect my own viewpoint back at me and don't say anything that I disagree with, is tends to be what they seem to actually mean by saying, I don't want politics in my X or Y.
So I understand you're from our future 51st state. You're a Montreal native,
That is
if I have
correct.
have that right, and you moved to Philly, New Jersey, the East
Yeah,
Coast.
Yeah, lived in New Jersey for a while, currently in the Philadelphia area. Have been here, I guess, almost as long as I lived in Montreal, so
Okay.
I'm maybe a true dual citizen at this point in terms of equal time spent in both places.
Yeah, my parents were Hungarian and they emigrated after the Second World War. So I've always felt a bit like a stranger in a strange land.
Mhm.
How does that Canadianness influence your view of America, of where we are, where we're going, and ultimately how you look at your creativity?
I mean, it is interesting because, I mean, obviously the US and Canada are such, close geographic neighbors, and there is a lot of sort of common cultural touch points and a lot of, the media that I watched growing up was sort of coming from the United States. But there is, a certain, I guess, Canadian flavor to things as well. I mean, there are some things that I watched that I talked to about people here, and they're like, "What?" I'm like, "Oh, right, yeah, that only existed in Canada. You have no idea what I'm talking about." Um, and I do feel like there is, a certain flavor within a lot of Canadian speculative fiction that is sort of distinct and unique. And I don't know whether that, does influence my work or make its way in here and there. But I do feel like there is sort of a lot of, you know, in horror, I feel like you see a lot of sort of like nature as the antagonist type thing in Canadian fiction, and maybe just because there is so much space in a lot of Canada, where more trees than people and more empty land than people, that it is kind of easy to get
Moose
the
gone
idea of
wild.
yeah, nature is hostile, and I don't even think that's just speculative fiction. I feel like that's a sort of Canadian literature thing in general, is a little bit of fixation on environment, sense of place, and um, obviously not every single piece, but I do feel like it is a recurring theme.
I think Americans misunderstand Canadians. So the general sensibility for most Americans, and I guess I could articulate it because I'm an American dude, is Canadians are nice, and you say a boot, and you're made fun of on South Park because you're kind of goofy. You talk
Yeah.
funny, and there are a lot of mooses, and you're like America's hat. So we're connected, and we're a lot alike. But you guys are kind of up there. You're like the suburb of America, but generally you're pretty tame and mostly harmless.
Oh, so I feel like that is the general perception, yes.
And then I worked at a Canadian agency in marketing and PR with a healthcare focus for a number of years. And I would commute to Toronto on a regular basis from New York. And I think I got to know Canadians fairly well. And beneath that veneer of a boot niceness, there's a strong competitiveness, which is we're tired of being outshined by you bozos. And we are our own kick-ass people, and we're driven, and we get it done, and we can show you a few things if given the chance. And Montreal is its own thing because the Québécois. But how does that jibe with your own drive and feeling of Canada, U.S., North America? And lastly, it's within this contentious Trumpian age of turning our allies into enemies and turning the world order upside down.
Yeah, I mean, I do feel like there is a little bit of a sometimes feeling of like, sort of the younger sibling, vying for attention or being in the shadow of, an older sibling, between the US and Canada relationship in terms of, I mean, I guess there are sort of, polite people and rude people everywhere. There's not sort of a monolith that's any describes, accurately describes any country. Um, I sometimes actually almost feel like, there's sort of commonalities more in like vertical lines, like a lot of commonalities between Northeastern people, whether it's in Canada or in the US. And then sort of similar with like the prairie provinces in the Midwest in the US, you'll get some similarities. And then sort of the West Coast,
That's very
where
perceptive.
like
That's
people on
on
the
point.
East
Yeah.
Coast in Canada might be very different from the West Coast in Canada. So it is interesting to see, the commonalities and differences and how those various lines split.
I visited Germany and they have different accents, obviously. So in Hamburg, it's kind of a New York accent in German, of
Mhm.
course. And if you go down to Munich in Bavaria, it's almost like a southern drawl of German. So it's your exact point that we delineate these regions. We tend to lump everyone together based on these arbitrary boundaries. It depends on your climate, the topography, the legacy culture, and even
Mhm.
the weather.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
so it can vary tremendously. But being a writer gives you a unique opportunity to channel all that into your stuff. How much of a part of your life is your creativity? I know you need to juggle. I heard you on the Nerd Count podcast with Matthew, and how much of what you do is bent around this need to express yourself and to do so for so many years?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a big part of my life. I do also have a full-time day job, but I try to sort of balance where I'm setting aside time either in the evenings or on the weekends to, focus on my own creative things versus, day job things. Um, sometimes with varying degrees of success, but I do try to at least keep sort of weekends for myself. I'm sort of a proponent of like work time is work time and, protect my time that is away from work. Um, but I do sort of also like that balance too of sort of having both.
Where did the writer bug come from? Writing is doing. You're a writer if you write. I've known many people who've had aspirations to write. Almost everyone feels like, I'm going to write that book, or I have a book in me. And it seems to be a part of a long bucket list of stuff that people never really do. And it's aspirational in a cliched kind of way. You've been doing it for decades now. Where did it come from? Is there a bug in the family, like a writing DNA, a string of nucleosides that are shared where the Scrivener came out in you? Or you wake up one morning and say, I want to AC wise, I want to be a writer, and then you just did it? How did this happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something that I've always been drawn to, and I can't really imagine not doing it. I definitely come from a family of big readers, not necessarily writers, but I think also sort of people with some form of, artistic impulse in one direction or another, whether it's cooking or painting or music or whatever it might be. So, definitely there's that sort of creative spark in the family, but I think I'm really the only one that's gravitated towards writing that I know of. Maybe there's sort of somewhere way back in my ancestry, but yeah, I mean, it's something that I sort of always wanted to do, even from sort of like a little kid, typing up like 1 to 2 sentence quote unquote stories. Um, that sort of writing impulse was always there. And, luckily my family was very encouraging. And I had some teachers early on who were very encouraging, who sort of, helped me see that, this could be a viable thing that could carry through my life. And if not be, a full time profession, at least a professional pursuit. Sort of when I started off, it's just like something that I like to do for myself. And it never really sort of clicked in my head that, oh, yes, there are people who do this. And, the books that are on my shelf were written by people. And I'm a person and I can write things too that could be on somebody else's shelf. And like, so eventually that connection came. But um, yeah, I feel like the impulse to write was there before I kind of, made the correct connection of like, it could also be a profession.
The sensibility that seems ubiquitous to me of looking at your stuff is that there's a sincerity in that very process. You're not writing for flash, bells and whistles. It's not like Horton Hears a Who, here I am, here I am. And you create a space which is true to itself. So if you got a short story, you lock into a singular mood and you go for it. And when the story's done, you're done. And I don't get this self aggrandizing feeling of busting out, trying to prove yourself, or getting that Netflix miniseries deal. I see you loving what you do and doing it well. And I think that's pretty badass. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, lovely if Netflix wants to make something out of something I do one day. I mean, the author goals, right? But I mean,
Yeah.
it's not a prerequisite for continuing to work, just like, being a bestseller or award recognition or whatever the case may be is not a prerequisite. I'm going to keep doing this no matter what. And hopefully people will find my work and enjoy my work. And I guess even if they don't, well, then, I still enjoyed the process.
And you have gotten recognition. So there's a long list of accolades that are tied after your name. So bravo and kudos to you. Nebula finalist, I think, and you've got attention. You're a name in the industry. Does that feel good? Is it
Oh, definitely.
it's not your primary motivation, because that's self-evident in the passion that you put into your work, but it's got to feel pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, it's always nice to be recognized for something that you love doing. But, awards are subjective as anything else is. And, I feel like sometimes there is sort of like, oh, well, the natural progression is I publish and then I publish somewhere bigger and then I start getting award recognitions. There's not just sort of like one path. Every author has their own path. And, just because something isn't, recognized with an award doesn't mean it's not an incredible piece of work. So it's definitely, wonderful to have. And I'm very grateful for every sort of recognition that I've gotten, but I try not to tie myself to it too much. And I hope other people don't either, just because, it can be kind of crushing to not be recognized at the same time. So you kind of have to, do it for the love. And then, you know,
See what
and
happens.
rejection sucks no matter what, but you sort of tie all yourself up in the hope of getting that or the expectation that it will come one day.
And you're an award judge too, aren't you? Aren't you involved in the process? So
Yeah, I have been a judge for the World Fantasy Awards,
cool.
sort of on the recommendation panel for the Locus Awards, and I'm actually currently serving as a judge for the Sunburst Awards, which is a Canadian specific award. So I'm currently in the midst of, award reading for that, which is a lot of fun.
And a lot of time. You're busy in addition to day job and having your quiet time over weekends. You got to squeeze in a lot of content, both input and output, right?
Yeah, well, luckily it's all stuff I love doing. So
That makes it intrinsically rewarding, right?
exactly. Yeah.
And aspirationally, you look at yourself 5 years from now. Do you have the Harry Potter fantasy series as something that you're brooding on, or do you look at it kind of ad hoc, like you're in the mood to write this and it comes out? You're not so much a plotter, but as they say, you're a prancer. So you're just kind of stewing in the work and letting it emerge. Is that overall your approach? You just love what you do, and let's see what happens next week, next month, 6 months from now, whatever pops into AC's mind and heart.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I don't have, things plotted out in terms of like exactly what I want to write next or, where I see myself career wise. It's just sort of take it as it comes and hope for the best.
That's cool. And the short story, I do want to focus on the short story because I don't understand why short stories aren't more popular than they actually are, given the short form that everyone is immersed in. We're in a Twitter culture. Attention spans are about, I post videos. I've got maybe 1 or 2 seconds or they're gone. I blog, I'm on Substack, and I see the metrics of engagement across multiple platforms for multiple genres, whether it's a political op-ed, whether it's a political rant. I wrote a novel. I've got a bunch of plays. I throw a lot of it out there, and it's little nuggets of people's attention, and they
Mhm.
come and they go. And I have a fan for 5 minutes. I have my Andy Warhol 15 seconds of fame when a video goes viral, and then I'm forgotten. I'm only as viable as when my bald head appears on the screen, or when my words somehow infiltrate their consciousness for anywhere from 5 seconds to 15 minutes. And I would just think that short stories in their inchoate, lovely form, going all the way back to Flannery O'Connor, would resonate. And it really doesn't. I mean, it kind of does, but people are always looking for the big book, the big sensation. Is it they just think that there's more value in something that's chunkier?
Yeah.
You've been a short story maestro and a short story reviewer for a long time. That's why I want to ask you that common sense and intuition would suggest that we just be reading and writing short stories when everyone's on Axios.com and tweeting.
Yeah, I mean, it is a weird paradox because, as you say, attention spans are short, short stories are short. You'd think there would be a nice synergy there. It doesn't take too much time, but I do think there is something to the idea of that sort of, perceived value of, if I'm going to spend money on this, I want it to be a giant doorstop novel. And I do think, well, actually, I don't know this for sure, but I feel like there could also be sort of that perception of like, oh, well, short stories were kind of the things I was forced to read in school. And so people have maybe like a negative association. They think they don't like short fiction, and they're not willing to give it a try again. I don't know if that's part of it, but I do think, a lot of people kind of just think that, they can't get immersed into a short story or it's not worth their time, so they're not going to bother, which is unfortunate.
It's so weird. I'm confused by this. And the converse of that is the encyclopedic narrative, which to me peaked with David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest. He got early 90s. He did a book tour. The thing is about 900 something pages long, and it was a New York Times bestseller. And it was dense. I read it, but I didn't know too many other people who did. And I actually saw him do a reading in Chicago at Barbara's Bookseller on Broadway. And I thought he was an asshole.
Yeah.
So to me, that was the flare up of the last really big book. And, Pynchon followed up, with Against the Day, which I thought sucked. And, the Gravity's Rainbow, Mason-Dixon masterpieces, I think culminating in Infinite Jest, that kind of tsunami of prose seems to have peaked. And the reason I bring that up is, I would just assume the converse might be strong, but it's not. Where the hell are we with publishing? I have trouble figuring this out. It's so fragmented, I don't even know if there's an answer to it.
Yeah. I mean, maybe the new immersion, instead of reading doorstop novels, is binge watching a series where they're mainlining the entire thing all at once. So it's, 10 hours of viewing versus episode by episode. Even as people have fragmented attention spans. So, who knows?
Have you thought about actively pitching your stuff to these Netflix streamer content hunters? Is that part of your own marketing efforts? I mean, you've reached a certain critical mass with your extended career, and especially with your presence as a reviewer. People know you. You do a lot of writing. You do a lot of reviewing. How much self-promotion do you do, and how do you do it?
I am admittedly terrible at self-promotion. I try, as all authors are kind of expected to do. My agent does actually work with somebody who does pitch things to media for properties, so that's nice. I don't have to do that part myself, which is good because I don't have any of those connections.
Or the sensibility as a writer, again, talking about the two different parts of the brain. I love creating content. I love it. I could just barf this stuff out in all its forms all day. But knocking on doors and sending emails, oh, look at me. Read my treatment, read my PDF. I hate that.
Yeah. And I think a lot of, authors and creatives in general don't necessarily naturally gravitate to that. Some people are fantastic at both, but not everybody is.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, how athletes are then expected to be amazing public speakers and
Yes.
have microphones shoved in their faces and, say brilliant things to the stupidest questions like, "Oh, you just lost that game. How do you feel?" "Oh, how do you think I feel?"
Right. Right.
It's just sort of an odd dichotomy of the way people are sort of expected to market themselves and represent themselves or, have entire second careers as media personalities in order to catch attention, which, is not necessarily a natural fit or a skill set that crosses over in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, I think like a book like Ballad of Bone Road, right? I think, the moodiness of it, the setup with this haunted metropolis, and then the romance between the characters is kind of a flame that ignites the whole story. And then the visit, and then the ghost hunters within a ghost world. It's kind of meta.
Mhm.
I think that'd be badass for a cool show.
I think it would be cool too.
Just
You never know.
saying. And there's so
Keep my
much
fingers
crap.
crossed.
Yeah, there's so much crap out there, right? That's what kind of drives me nuts is how fragmented a lot of these media empires are. And I know that it's tough. I've got a relative of the family who's a professional screenwriter, and he's got a tough time. He's in, right? And it's hard for him too to get
Mhm.
stuff made. So imagine being outside that circle, how difficult it is to get in when the people inside are literally killing each other just to get attention and to get something made. Like John Waters used to complain, like people would come up to John Waters and say, "Here's my screenplay. What do you
Mhm.
think?" And he's like, "Get away from me. I have a tough time making
Yeah.
movies. I have a tough time getting the cash to do what I want to do. Do you think I'm going to pitch you?"
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, from the perspective of production companies, I mean, what are they willing to take a risk on? And from a business perspective, it sort of makes sense for them to go with things that are known quantities or things that they can feel reasonably confident about rather than, taking risk on things, whether that's, something outside of a series that they're already doing or, would you can make, say, another Marvel movie and then get people in the theaters and paying money for it, like,
Yeah.
why not just keep doing what works?
Yeah, back to eyeballs and asses. We're going
Yep.
to regurgitate, Avengers number 28. We know we'll make at least $200 million.
Yeah.
But if you
Or
bring us the Ballad of the Bone Road, they're like, what the F is this? And then
yeah,
all you're
exactly.
asking is a little bit of creativity and guts, but that's already asking for too much when it's all
Mhm.
about the money all the time. And
Yeah.
I
Well, I mean, it's
personally
just
just think it's a shame because you've got entrenched legacy proven storytellers like yourself. You've paid your dues and you got great stories that come from the heart. And I just think the dice should roll in a much broader way to let folks repurpose their content.
yeah. I mean, that would be nice, but it does seem like, there's always the gravitate towards the remake, the sequel, the prequel, whatever it is. And I mean, even sort of in bookshelf space, you still see, entire chunks of bookstore shelves dedicated to Tolkien, as opposed to all the new things that have been published. So, safe bet when it comes to money is probably always going to win out. But then every now and then there's, sort of a wonderful success story like Sinners, not that Ryan Coogler is an unknown, but, the
Yeah,
fact that it's sort of a creator-owned property that, sort of took the world by storm and proved that, there is one new things to do with vampire fiction, that, a genre movie could be that successful and, cross over so many things. So, you would hope that, some studios would see that and see that,
yeah.
oh, there is actually an appetite for this rather than just, the safe bet of once again, remaking Frankenstein or
And this brings us
remaking
full circle
whatever.
because Sinners is a great example because that script does what you do, which is the vampires don't come into that movie until more than halfway through the damn movie. And they almost feel intrusive. Like,
Mhm.
I got so into these characters and their circumstances that, wait a second, now the vampires are going to complicate this already complicated, intriguing human drama. So the fact that Sinners did well, I think, is so nice because it reinforces the strength of good storytelling. It's not like shit blows up in the first 20 seconds.
Yeah.
And then it's just a cascading effect of pyrotechnics and cheap shots for gaining and sustaining attention for long enough that you don't leave to go take a leak before the commercial interruption.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's always nice to see something original and something thoughtful, capture people's attention.
Absolutely. And in the attention economy, I have to say, kudos to you for commanding and sustaining attention in your own way, on your own terms for so long.
Well, I try.
So that's awesome. So thank you for making time on the Science Fiction and Fantasy Factory. Ladies and gentlemen, AC Wise, get her new book. I'm going to put a link in the description for your new book and your website. And for folks, if they don't know you already, to get to know your good stuff. And any message for the world of our listeners and viewers?
Just, I guess, thank you for being here. Thank you for the wonderful conversation. And for people out there, keep reading, keep shouting about the things that you love, keep being, passionate about whatever you're passionate about.
Absolutely. And just real quickly, for writers, up and coming writers, what kind of little nudge can you give to help folks along?
There's no wrong way to tell a story or write a project, and you know what's best for it at the end of the day. Find your own process, find what works, and find what keeps you putting words on the page rather than following somebody else's advice of how you have to do something.
Amen to that. And, just follow your heart, right? And if you want a
Exactly.
beta reader, go for it, but you don't have to listen to all the feedback. Trust your intuition. Thank you, Alison, for making time. Really appreciate it. Like, comment, share, etc. And I'd love to bring you back in 6 months, a year, for your next adventure.
Yeah, sounds wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.